Welcome back to the KRUSE podcast. What's up, Tony?
What's going on, Taylor?
Are you refreshed from a little vacay time?
Refreshed is never... I was refreshed. And then I got back to real life and then got unrefreshed super quickly. Some of that's my own fault, but you know, it's the cycle. The cycle continues.
Same here. We've had a nice break, and let's see. So right after the 4th of July, we went camping, and that was awesome. And then that kind of overlapped with the next weekend, and I was feeling refreshed, but now, like you, I'm playing catch up. You know,
man, that's lovely. That's lovely.
It was.
When you're out camping, are you looking at your phone ever?
Well, so to take pictures and do stuff like that, but we didn't have service. Yeah. We didn't have anything.
You didn't have the option.
Yeah, we didn't have the option, which is pretty typical when we camp. You know, we were about an hour and a half north of where we live. So we were up by Mount Washington, and, you know, just, limited service. And that's usually how it goes when we camp. So, which I like.
No, I think that's one of the main benefits to me. It's just like you're just completely unplugged.
Yeah.
And it's more and more precious in our modern time, I feel like.
Yeah.
Did you get out fishing at all? Were you able to make an escape?
Yeah, we fished, kind of like family fishing. You know, it's not like the, you know, intense missions that I like to run.
Tactical fishing.
Yeah, it wasn't as tactical. You know, it's in some ways it was, but, you know, we were with our other friends, and they have 2 young boys, and both of them will do some fishing, and one of them's really into it. Our daughter is into it, you know, as much as she can be as a 5-year-old. And so we all did like a hike up. It was elevation, and it's kind of cool because we call it blue lining. And basically what blue lining means is you can look at any region where it's, you know, there's mountains and stuff around us, the White Mountains, and you can basically find all the little blue lines on the map. Some of them are named little streams, and some of them are so small that they're unnamed. And we call that blue lining. And that's typically what we do in the hottest periods of the summer, because the trout fishing in other places where the water gets a little too warm gets dangerous for the fish. So like if you catch them, you'll probably kill them accidentally. And, you know, we catch and release primarily. So we blue line in the summertime, especially in August. And so that means hiking up to some of these little streams at elevation. They're really small, really beautiful, big boulders, lots of little plunge pools, crystal clear, and they're full of native brook trout, right? Wow. So, and the fish are eager and they're easy to catch. And, you know, I can put the rod in my daughter's hand, and, you know, she can catch a couple brook trout in a short period of time, you know, with the attention span that she has, and it's awesome.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So we did that, and it was cool. I did a little bit of fishing, probably not as much as I wanted to when we were doing that, because I actually got carried away taking pictures, which was cool. And I got some good ones. I had my nice camera with me.
Oh,
and
nice.
It was a blast.
Oh man, you'll have to send me something.
Yeah, I will.
That sounds lovely.
Yeah, it was great. We got another camping trip lined up coming quick too. We've got one at the beginning of August. We're going out to the Berkshires in Western Mass, and we'll meet up with our same friends. And then we finish our little camping circuit at the end of August. We're actually going out to Cape Cod. So we'll camp on the outer Cape, which will be nice.
A charmed life.
Yeah. This is good. This has been a nice summer, and it's gonna be really nice to have those things in the calendar. So
yeah. I often think about it in terms of like getting away from work and responsibilities, and it's like, you know, I just opened by saying like, oh, like I was refreshed, but now you know, it doesn't feel like it anymore. But you know what you do get, even if you're playing catch up, you get the memories, you know, and the work, it all kind of blends together. But stuff like this, it's punctuated. You'll have pictures, you'll have fish with your daughter, and yeah, that's amazing. I'm super happy.
Yeah, it's good. So now it's just, you know, we've been answering emails, we've been catching up in our community. I've been starting to get back on Instagram because, you know, I took quite a long break there, and So the algorithm is reminding me that, I haven't posted in a while. It
Yeah.
always starts off kind of slow, and our followers don't see everything, and then as we kind of start posting with more consistency, people start seeing it and there's more engagement, and then I'm busy there, and yeah, so just getting back into the swing of things.
Yeah. Speaking of swing of things and getting back into it, I think I finally am getting the hang of Indian club windmills,
Nice.
and so it's fun. I'm like able to actually kind of really string them together.
Nice.
And so my question for you is just for like I use it as a warm up essentially before I
Yeah.
do other stuff.
Yep.
But if I were to be more purposeful with it, how do you recommend programming for stuff like that?
You know what? The warm up idea is great. I think that is a good way to go. I typically do that a lot.
Hmm.
And I also will just create dedicated skill sessions that are almost like an extension of the warm up. And that's typically where I will insert more technical things that demand a lot of coordination. Beyond that, occasionally I will just pair it with other strength exercises, because rather than kind of sitting down and twiddling my thumbs after doing, you know, something heavy,
Hmm.
I'm getting that recovery time, but I'd rather be doing something that I could be using as kind of an active recovery and learning something at the same time.
Hmm.
So that's occasionally I'll take one of my steel club exercises, not usually that heavy if I'm pairing it up with something else that's strength
Right.
related, or I'll take the Indian clubs and I'll do that paired with a heavy strength training exercise and just take a few minutes to kind of practice. With those clubs, I'm not counting reps really. I'm not doing anything like that. I'm just practicing.
Hmm.
When I mess up, I start over, and I'll do that for a few minutes and then go back to whatever strength exercise I'm working on. So, yeah, I mean, that's typically how I do it, just to kind of keep it simple.
Hmm. Yeah, because a lot of the benefit is the coordination effort, right?
Yeah,
Complex, nonlinear movement,
you
but
got it.
then also, I mean, there's a mobility component, right? And you're
No question.
getting
Yeah.
increased circulation and you're, moving your shoulder joint through a full range of motion.
Yeah.
So maybe heavy isn't the goal.
Heavy's not the goal. That's right. That's right. Heavy's not the goal. You get a great deal of shoulder mobility out of the clubs. You also, it kind of goes under the radar, but there's a lot going on with your hands
Hmm.
that I
Yep.
find very valuable, because your hands for most people are completely neglected when it comes to fitness. Very, very rarely is somebody, doing hand exercises. I mean, people who get it do it. They practice strength with their hands and mobility with their hands and their fingers. But I mean, generally speaking, people leave that out. So you get a lot out of Indian club work with your hands. Yeah. So and you can do them at different speeds too. And I think there's a lot of value with that. And you get a lot of spinal mobility out of this too. It's not just isolated to the shoulders.
Spinal mobility. How's
Yeah.
how's that happening?
Well, you are going into a fair amount of spinal extension when you're bringing the clubs behind you. All right. So there's that. There's also rotation involved, because using the clubs may feel somewhat isolated, but it's really not. You're rotating your spine and your rib cage, right? And you're also going into extension when your arms go up overhead. And yeah, so there's more there than meets the eye, when it comes to the spine.
Yeah. No, it's a really fun skill and exercise. So once I really get this down pat, I'm gonna, get some scarves and move on to juggling. That'll be my next skill
Oh, that's
conquest.
great. That's great. Yeah, we actually have to buy. We were talking about this recently. We have to buy some new ones. Ours just kind of, I don't know. They got pretty beat up, and we need to get some because they're a really good training tool for our daughter as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so awesome to learn how to juggle with. You can do so much with them.
How young would you teach someone how to juggle?
So the youngest person I've ever taught to juggle, I think for me was 8.
Okay.
I taught an 8-year-old girl how to juggle. This was many years ago. Just somebody I was working with when we were doing some in-person stuff, and used the scarves, and she was quite successful. Yeah. So, we're getting there.
Well, if an 8-year-old can do it, I
Yes.
can do it.
Maybe it's tough to make the transition from the scarves to like balls.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, anyone can learn how to juggle, but it does take some practice, and it can be frustrating, but it's not too bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's also one of those things like riding a bike. Like you once you dial it in, like I don't practice it that much anymore, but once in a while I'll just grab 3 tennis balls from our, I've got this crate that sits next to my squat rack, and I've got different stuff in there, and I might be like, well, what should I do to warm up today? And then I see those tennis balls and I'm like, okay, I'll do some juggling. And I never forget how.
Yeah.
It might be a little rusty, but then you shake the rust off pretty quick. It's weird like that. It's very similar to like riding a bike. You can just do it. I never got amazing at it, but I can juggle 3 balls solidly, with good coordination. And then I can even use letter balls, which is actually a really favorite vision exercise that I like, where you take tennis balls and you write letters. I mean, you could use numbers too, but we do letters all over the tennis ball. And then as you're juggling them, whichever ball is at like the apex of the curve as you're throwing the balls up, you say what letter you see. And so you're basically very quickly doing little visual saccades, which is just moving your eyes a little bit left and right as you focus on the ball and try to find the letter. Awesome integrated vision exercise. Mm-hmm. Really, really good. So that's kind of like the progression. It goes scarves, then it goes balls, or like we have like little bean bags.
I was going to say bean bags might be a little easier, right?
Yeah,
it's easier to grab.
Totally. Yeah, I actually like the feel of them. So scarves, bean bags, balls, letter balls.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great progression to follow.
And then letter balls with different colors.
You can make color balls, number balls. You can do all of those on one ball. I've done a lot of different a lot of different styles. When I was teaching my daughter how to catch and throw, we used the color ball, right? And that was pretty good for helping her, because she had for a while she was having a difficult time focusing on the ball when it got really close to her face, mm-hmm. as she was sort of like building her convergence skills. I noticed she was kind of in a period where they needed some work, and she was flinching when the ball would come into a certain kind of zone close to her face. And the color ball really solved that quickly, because it gave her a target, right? It just added that extra focus. And, I started out by just walking the ball into her face rather than throwing it, and she would call the color and actually reach out and touch it. And then I started at, a few feet away and kind of lobbed it at her, and she would call the color and catch it. And that just sort of evolved into standing 10 feet back. And then, before you know it, she was calling them out and catching them very well. It's great.
It occurs to me that your applied neurology and coaching background would make you a pretty killer, like, young sports coach, because
I used to coach wrestling
stuff. I even mean just at like a very young age, like,
oh sure,
when the brain is still learning how to do things for the first time, right?
Yeah, that would be fun. I mean, I often wonder if I'll circle back at some point to like more coaching. I do miss coaching wrestling, and the thing is, when I coached wrestling, I knew a lot of cool stuff, but I didn't know neuro. Mm-hmm. And we were definitely, we were still the weird people doing the weird stuff. Don't get me wrong. I've been
it's in your blood,
I've been doing things that are not. Yeah, I've been doing things that are not widely accepted forever, basically. And so it was great. We had a lot of fun and a lot of success. But like the neuro piece, now I'm like, how would I approach that? And mm-hmm. There's a lot to think about there, and it would be cool. And there was a short time period where I was sort of on the tail end of doing a lot of the youth development stuff for sports that I used to do. I used to team up with a good friend of mine, and she was also into developing youth athletes, and we did a lot of Burdenko method together because it's such an amazing system for physical education. A lot of coordination, a lot of balance, a lot of mobility. And at that point, I was just starting to get into the neuro. And so we were blending some of that into it, which was really cool. So a lot of the integrated style stuff that didn't demand so much isolation. It was cool.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned an important word or important phrase earlier when we were talking about Indian clubs.
Yeah.
And you said spinal mobility. It's good for your
Yes.
spinal mobility. And spinal mobility is something that I've heard about for a long time. I know it feels good when I do like a T-spine stretch or like a yoga pose. That kind of how I think about it is kind of like opens that up for me.
Right.
But other than that, I don't really think about it much. And it wasn't until our episode on the 8 levels of applied neurology that spinal mobility, the importance of it, kind of started to click in my mind from an applied neuro perspective, right? And so I thought we would do an episode dedicated to spinal mobility, and maybe we'll talk about the midline in general.
Yeah.
I'll leave that up to you. And then, hopefully we can go over some tips and tricks and drills that people can do at home.
Nice. I like it.
So to start off, why do we care about spinal mobility?
Yeah.
Why does it matter?
It's a great question. The spine is a high order system. We talk about high order systems. If you've been listening to the podcast, you've been hearing about high order systems, the eyes, the inner ear, the vestibular system, right? Talking about different brain regions, the cerebellum, the cortex, all the different lobes, the brain stem. These are all high order systems. The spinal cord is one of those high order systems. And when we look at why it's important, there's so many reasons why it's important. I think the first ones that are easiest to understand is if you just look at what the spine is, in terms of like more biomechanically. In fact, when I was sort of getting my mind in the zone before this episode, I was just kind of quickly looking up a couple of things, and I was like, wait a minute, I've never actually looked into how many dedicated joints would be in the spine. Like typically we talk about spinal segments. You've got the upper spinal cord, like the cervical segments, which is your neck. You've got the kind of middle area of the spinal cord, which is known as the thoracic spine, and even the rib cage is part of that. And then the low back area, we've got the lumbar segments. And then below that, we've got the sacral area. And I kind of just always am thinking about it like that. And I never really looked into like, okay, there's a lot of segments there, right? And that tells me that by design, there's a lot of movement there because there's a lot of individual bones, right? Anywhere in the body where there are lots of bones, well, there's a lot of movement that takes place, and it's also a very proprioceptively rich area. So I looked it up. It's like, found a couple different varying answers, but things were roughly close enough. And this is kind of crazy to think about, but what I found says the human spinal column contains over 130 mobile joints. So, and I'd never really looked at it, like joints, right? So that to me is crazy. That's wild. And so, other areas of the body that have lots of joints, the feet,
I was thinking
the hands
too.
Yeah. We have a lot of joints in the cranium, actually, in our head, which is also an interesting one that's kind of wild to think about. And then, of course, if you're considering the rib cage as part of the thoracic spine, we have a lot of joints in the thoracic spine and rib cage. But man, that's a lot of joints. And so that tells you by design, it was intended for movement. A lot of movement. and that a lot of force has to be able to be transferred through it. So that in itself creates some interesting questions, because what do we know about kind of how general fitness views the spine? Well, they don't. Because the thing you always learn in general fitness about the spine is keep it neutral, right? Don't move it, right? Or you hear about, having back pain and going to your doctor and they're like, you got to stop moving your back. When you bend over to pick stuff up, make sure you don't flex your spine because that's bad for you, right? There's so many funny things that you hear in regard to the spine. And those funny things really, I think, have become funny things because overall people feel like I think a lot of it comes down to when your back hurts, it feels very serious, right? Like if you've ever had back pain, like real back pain, like pretty intense back pain, you feel very fragile. You feel very compromised. You feel incredibly compromised. If you've ever had sacral pain or like lumbar pain that has really sidelined you, you feel incredibly compromised. And I think that a lot of the rules that we've made in fitness and in health around the spine, like the silly ones, like don't move your spine, are because of how fragile and compromised you can feel when you have an issue there. And the bottom line is, if you look at how the spine is designed in all of those joint areas and segments, just based on that alone, you know that this is a structure that is designed to move with complexity, right? That's the thing. It's with complexity. So that's one idea. Now, if you look into the contents of the spinal cord itself, still thinking anatomically here, and mechanical, there's a lot of contents of the spinal cord that nobody ever considers or talks about, especially with, when we're talking fitness. The only time the contents of the spinal cord really get brought up in conversation is if you are seeking help on a back issue, and maybe you get images done and you get somebody to look at your spine, and you're looking at the integrity of your spinal cord and discs and, facet joints and all that. But really, there's a lot more there, right? There's a lot more there. In fact, I encourage our listeners to look up a cross section of the spinal cord. It's like just easy to Google up, and look up, to be a little bit more specific, look up descending motor pathways and ascending sensory pathways of the spinal cord and find a cross section of that. It's very interesting. You'll see that there's a lot of internal contents to the spinal cord that gives you an idea of how important the spine is for essentially everything that we do. Everything for performance, everything for survival. You're going to see actual cross section of tracks that, for movement. You're going to see actual cross sections of different sensory systems. Like, for example, and we've talked a little bit about these in past episodes, the dorsal column system and the spinal thalamic system. These are essentially sensory pathways that transmit very specific types of sensory information to the spinal cord, to other parts of the spinal cord, and also the brain. And so it's just cool to get this visual and see all the contents, because thinking again more mechanically, when you see how many joints there are in the spinal cord, and then you actually go a little further and look at the contents of the spinal cord with, nerve roots and those branching out into peripheral nerves and all these cross sections of ascending and descending pathways that exist, it is so easy to build the case for why it is important to move this structure. Because if we don't move it, guess what? What you don't use, you lose. That is very real. And so, in order to keep our spinal cord healthy, so that all of these things can continue to function well, peripheral nerves and all of these sensory and motor pathways, we got to move it, right? We can't ignore it. And it's one of those areas of the body that, for some reason, to this day, is still kind of misunderstood and gets tagged as fragile, and it's not at all. And we just kind of ignore it. People pay more attention to, biceps and triceps, than they do the spine. But if you're an athlete, the spine is a big deal, right? Because if you can improve your spinal mobility, and this goes beyond just mobility, and maybe we'll talk about different things, but that alone can help you from a performance standpoint, right? And a lot of times what I see is that when people have injuries, regardless of what that injury even is, and they become more sedentary, and people start to go through the aging process. Some people find themselves in different health crises along the way, where there's a disease state of some kind. What you will often see is that people lose the ability to move their trunk and spine, and this is not a good thing. All right, so we got to put this at the top of our priority list when it comes to structures of the body that we want to keep in good health. And one of the ways that we can do that is by knowing how to move it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess in a strength training context, I would think about the spine in terms of just it being able to bear load.
Yes.
So, if you're squatting, a heavy amount of weight on your back, it was pretty clear to me that your spine needed to transfer that force or the muscles around it or whatever down to your feet, right?
Yep.
So I feel like that's a kind of like a primal example of why the spine is important. But then also you mentioned all of those pathways.
Right.
And I think in a previous episode, we kind of called it like an information super highway, right?
Yes.
It's like all of the touch sensation and temperature sensation and, all of these different feelings that you get from your extremities and your body, they get routed through the spine and up to the brain where you're actually processing that information, right?
You got it. Yes.
So if there's a problem along the way, maybe in the spine, you mentioned just now injury or disease or just being sedentary, maybe that blurs that connection.
No question. It's like a kink in the garden hose, It's like a kink in the garden hose. And that's how we want to look at it, as an information superhighway, because all of the inputs that are coming in from the outside world through our different sensory systems, well, that information is eventually going to make its way to the spinal cord and ascend the spinal cord, and like you said, to get it to the brain for processing. So if your spine doesn't move well, or you've had a previous injury that's affected the integrity of the spinal cord, people have different history things, disc injuries, and there's a lot of different things that can come up when you have spinal issues. Yeah, that is an interruption, basically, in terms of not only just how you move, because you will transfer force differently and possibly be more compromised in certain ways, but as far as the neural inputs go, it's interference, right? It's interference, and interference slows down everything, and it skews signaling, right? So quality of signals from brain to body and body to brain, they get less, right? And that's a big deal for sure.
So what does that look like? Like, what are some common issues you might see with a compromised
Spine?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So some history finding stuff. Common issues is muscle weakness is one. So if you have a spinal cord issue, it is possible that you will experience muscle weakness. Now, that weakness can be one-sided. It can also be bilateral. And that's something to really point out here, is that a lot of times when somebody has bilateral issues in the extremity, the spinal cord is actually the problem. So this is very important for listeners to hear, because I talk to people all the time who complain of bilateral elbow tendonitis. That is not an elbow problem, most likely. Right? Bilateral Achilles tendon issues. That's probably not an Achilles tendon issue primarily. Right? So when you see that bilateral patterning, all arrows point back to the midline. Okay, so bilateral issues like tendon problems or muscle problems, often we want to think about muscle weakness. Other common ones for history findings, you can have sensory issues, right? So if you've got spinal cord problems happening, you could have sensory loss, maybe of a specific type of sensation or even several sensations to one side of the body, maybe one area of the body, or in some more significant cases, even bilaterally, both sides of the body. Like, for example, quite a few years ago, I worked with a gentleman who had several different injuries that resulted in brain damage, and he broke his neck essentially.
Jeez.
And he did it twice, and the stories are horrific. One of them, he was driving, and there was a big truck in front of him, and a sheet of ice came off the top of the truck, went through his windshield, and impacted him. And then not that much longer later, like a couple of years, at this point, he was still very compromised and recovering from the first injury. He was sitting on a stool, fell off the stool. So I think he passed out for some reason related to his health, because he had a tough go, and he broke his neck. I mean, talk about bad luck. So this guy, when he's very lucky, because he did get back to the point where he could walk, but he was very unstable. He had to rehab and build back. And what we saw was bilateral, very significant muscle weakness that did not improve with strength training. It didn't improve with strength training. So this is what, the gym bros have to hear this. Like, progressive overload doesn't always work when you have serious stuff going on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so this, he was trying to do a lot of whatever strength training he could do. And he was not successful at getting stronger. He had a lot of significant muscle tone issues. And when I started doing sensory testing on him, because when someone has spinal cord injuries in their history, it's a very good thing to start some sensory testing with them. And sure enough, he had some very, very large bilateral deficits. Specifically, now remember that cross section I talked about that I wanted our listeners to look up, specifically in the dorsal column system. So what that meant for him was that he could not feel vibration and light touch. He couldn't feel it. He could not feel it anywhere I tested him. And that's a very, very serious, large deficit. Mm-hmm. But when I poked him with a sharp needle, he said, ow. And when I poked him with a sharp needle and then the dull side of the same tool, he was able to tell me, that's sharp, that's dull. And when I touched him with a cold pack, he said, that's cold. And when I touched him with a warm pack, he said, that's warm. But when I touched him with vibration, he looked at me and said, I got nothing. And when I stroked his skin with a tissue, light touch, he said, I got nothing. So that is a very specific example of how, based on the actual contents of the spinal cord, how due to his injury somewhere, there is a very specific problem Remember that kink in the garden hose?
Mm-hmm.
That was causing him to not be able to feel any of the dorsal column sensations. And that's very important information to know, because now we know what missing sensation we have to work with and restore. But it's also very important because when you get into this material, like we teach in our courses, you learn where this ascending pathway starts and crosses in the midline, and then where it goes as far as processing at the cortical level. And then you have to consider, remember our 8 levels, you have to consider these different levels of neurology in the process of trying to restore the person's ability to feel the sensation. So there's a lot that can go wrong with a spinal cord injury, and obviously his case is pretty extreme, but I see this all the time at a more subtle level, where let's say, so I'm just thinking of people I've worked with. So I worked with a professional athlete for quite a number of years, and she was a alpine ski racer that had several disc injuries. It's pretty common for high-level skiers to eventually deal with disc issues because there's just so much force involved in skiing. And, this is a healthy individual, obviously competing at a high level, but still experienced mild sensory disturbances in her lower body because of the history of disc issues. There was also some things we found in there related to the spinal cord too, like an absent deep tendon reflex, right? Which is sometimes what happens to people when they've had disc issues. And as a professional athlete, you do not want your deep tendon reflexes not working.
Yeah.
That is like taking the shocks off your car. Not good, right? So deep tendon reflex issues, mild sensory loss, not so mild, more extreme sensory loss. These are all really common things that you see when the spinal cord has been compromised in some way. And, that's not to say the obvious ones like pain. We didn't even say that yet. And having a pain issue because of either just a blurry map with the spine, or sometimes we have more mechanical issues, right? We have compression on a nerve root that can become very painful, right? So there's a lot of mechanical things and mechanical sensitivity to consider too. And one of the less talked about things that also is a history finding for spinal cord issues for some people is visceral dysfunction. So someone who's experiencing a good deal of viscerally mediated pain, which essentially means you feel pain either in your abdomen or there's other referral areas in the body. If our listeners have not seen a chart yet for visceral referral areas, you should definitely look one up. Look up Dr. Head's zones. So head zones. And what you will find is a chart that shows common referral areas for pain symptoms that have nothing to do necessarily with mechanical sensitivity, but more to do with a problem or, let's say, irritation of an organ. And this is very important to know as a professional. If you're a professional in health and fitness and you have not learned this yet, look this up, because this matters. People with a lot of spinal cord issues sometimes experience more visceral pain. Everyone experiences visceral pain. It's not that it's not common. It's just that we need to know when it's presenting like visceral pain so that we can understand more what's happening. And it's very interesting because when you look at the chart, you'll see that, for example, the low back, like the lumbar area all the way, if you think about like your oblique muscles and how they wrap around your sides, basically like your low back, all of your oblique area, all the way down into your groin and the outside of your hips is all associated with the kidneys. Okay. A very common thing that we see is that people that have issues going on with their liver or even their gallbladder, may get referral pain to the right side of the scapula, or even like the right QL area. Do you know
Hmm.
how many clients have told me they have a problem with their right scapula and right QL? And even the right shoulder, like up around in the upper trap region. That's also like a liver gallbladder referral zone. Only on the right side, primarily. I think there's going to be instances where it's not perfect, but yeah, it's very, very interesting. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of zones there to know about. And there's even some for the stomach, and there's some for the appendix. There's some for the urinary bladder. Yeah, it's really, really useful to know.
So, quick question about that.
Yeah,
When we spoke about viscerally referred pain
yeah,
earlier, the takeaway that I had was sometimes these organs, when they're in trouble, they don't actually have the same sensory pathways, the same nerve pathways to communicate that to the brain. Like, you're not feeling your kidney on a regular basis. So what they
yes.
do is they refer that pain to a nearby system, a nearby bundle of nerves. And
Skin and muscles.
Mhm.
Yeah, skin and muscles, basically.
So my question to you is, could you ever get a reverse? Could you ever get a problem where it shows like, for example, that pattern in the right trap scapula shoulder
Hmm.
would kind of indicate potentially the kidney might be having a viscerally referred pain reaction? Could it ever go the other way where the pathways indicate the kidney because there's a problem somewhere along the way? Or is that mostly just a one-way street in practice?
I don't think it's a one-way street. You're asking a question with an answer that is very not widely accepted.
Okay.
This is where we're now getting into acupuncture,
Okay.
right? We're getting into acupuncture is a great example. There is so much to know. You can't know it in a lifetime. It's wild. But there's a lot of theory that goes into other techniques, traditional Chinese medicine, and it goes way beyond what I just described. Way beyond. And so I think I want to say it's a two-way street, because I think that those clues that we get with different points, locations in the body that either become painful or even express more sympathetic tone.
Hmm.
For example, an area of the body that sweats a little bit more, or if you're into manual work and the differences in skin, right? Kind of boggy, saturated feeling skin, and excessively dry skin, indicating like sympathetic burnout. Like, for example, what you see is when someone has had a chronic issue for a long period of time in a certain body area, the skin usually gets thinner, drier, very chronically dry, scaly. And these are all indications of what's happening and how the nervous system is expressing sympathetic tone. So there's so many methodologies that use understanding the body's responses like this, and then being able to trace it back to a problem.
Hmm.
So there's a lot there. And this idea of head zones that I was just describing is a very great place to start. It's a very, very simple place to start, because visceral pain is super common. Some researchers say that most of the day-to-day pain that we experience is viscerally mediated. So, that low back discomfort that somebody might be feeling chronically might not actually be a mechanical problem. It might not be a problem with the spinal cord. It might be stress on the kidneys, right? That chronic right scapula that you've had released 1,000 times, the muscles around the scapula, or that right QL or right shoulder issue that you've been on and off. Nothing seems to actually ever fix it. Might be a liver that is working overtime, right? With, for whatever reason. There's a lot there, but it's good to know this. And also it's worth mentioning that typically viscerally mediated pain is more colicky and it's hard to pinpoint. So when you ask somebody what kind of pain are they experiencing and it happens to be visceral pain, they'll usually tell you that it's dull and achy. And when you ask them to point at the exact spot, they typically will not point at a very localized spot. They'll use their whole hand and basically show you a region of the body where they're experiencing the dull kind of achiness versus like, hey, it hurts right in this spot. Right. And a lot of times it is not reproducible with movement. So they'll tell you, when I move, I don't really feel it. But then like all day long at work, I'm sitting on the computer and I can kind of feel this like achiness or this on and off tension that I experience. So there's a specific presentation that is more common with viscerally mediated pain. And that's important to know too. And, and kind of sort of tying this together with the spinal cord, one idea worth, talking about is that like obviously scoliosis is an important topic when we discuss the spinal cord. It's a deformity of the spinal cord. And for more like extreme cases of scoliosis, a lot of times those individuals will have digestive problems. Right. So that's like one example you can think about where your digestion is affected by the spinal cord. And so you can have internal health things going on that are related to the spinal cord. And, our listeners who have been following along, remember my story, right? I thought I had a spinal cord problem, right? Back when I was, really struggling with a variety of things coming from mold exposure, mold toxicity. I was sure I had a spinal cord issue or, that was kind of, if you had asked me at the time, I would have said, yeah, I've got like some sort of compression going on that's causing me these symptoms down my leg. And in the end, I had to fix an inflammation problem that was gut related. So it's interesting to kind of understand the two-way street there, right? Mm-hmm. How you could have symptoms that mimic something like sciatica or piriformis syndrome, and in fact, it's really a gut problem, and therefore maybe not a spinal cord issue or peripheral nerve issue. So it's a two-way street, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, all of this stuff can get amorphous at times, right? But even so, you have some tools to assess very specific pathways. You mentioned some of these earlier when you were discussing your client who had broken his neck twice. Jeez. And, you were testing these different sensory pathways. So I'm curious, where do you start when it comes to assessing, the function of the spine from an applied neurology perspective? And maybe you can give a few more examples of stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it starts, for me anyway, it starts with motor assessments and mobility assessments first, right? So I want to see where a person can move and where they can't move well. And so evaluating basic movement of the spinal cord is something that I like to do. So basic flexions, and I'll have people flex through the spine and extend through the spine and side bend, right? If you can visualize this stuff. And I just want to see, like, can you rotate? Can you side bend? And when you're evaluating spinal mobility, you can get pretty precise with it and, palpate and think about like actual segments. Typically what you see is that areas that don't move well on the spine are often quite flat. So when you see somebody, for example, flex, and you're looking to see, okay, does this look like a healthy flexion where the load and the movement is shared throughout the spine? Oftentimes, for example, it's pretty common for people to have thoracic issues where they don't move well in their T-spine. And that area might look more flat compared to what you're seeing in the lower back area and even the neck. And so those little flat areas can indicate mobility, areas where mobility is needed. So that's one, thing to think about. Same thing when you're going into extension. You'll see, again, it's common in the thoracic area. You'll see like everything extend except the thoracic spine. I like to look at rotation and see, like, do they have a healthy amount of rotation? Is one side more limited than the other? That's a great place to begin. And just selecting mobility and motor control drills to target those areas of where the mobility concerns might be goes a long way. It goes a long way. And so that's why we have a whole series of thoracic mobility drills, like thoracic anterior posterior glides and lateral glides. These are all ways to start to build that motor control. I also like to evaluate the spine when walking. So I'll do a gait assessment, and I want to look and see what's moving, what's not, that kind of thing. Because you'll see like everyone's different. There's different compensatory things happening. You'll see people with very limited rotation. You'll see people with way too much movement in, let's say, the sacral area and the pelvic area, right? And that's causing a kind of a chain reaction up the spine. So I evaluate gait, and then at the same time, I'm doing a neurologic gait assessment, looking for different patterns that we might find. And, so these are just more of the movement-based things that I do. And I even will evaluate the spine with breathing. I think it's a very useful thing to do. When for example, we have a assessment that we test in our foundation, or that we teach in our foundations course, called a breathing wave assessment. Or an arrhythmic excursion assessment. So basically, the arrhythmic excursion is the person standing or seated, and you basically put your hands around their lower ribs, and you have them do some breathing, and you're feeling and observing whether or not the right stuff is moving, and whether or not they're moving in the right area of the rib cage. A lot of times, people who are very restricted in the rib cage and thoracic spine won't be able to move well in the lower ribs. I like this other version where you lay somebody down on the floor or something, and you have them do some breathing for a couple minutes, and you watch the wave-like action that should be happening as they breathe, and you see expansion of hopefully the lower ribs. You'll actually see movement that begins at the sacrum and in a wave-like action moves up the spine. And if you put your hands on the different segments, you can feel movement that's happening. So that the spine is involved, and the rib cage is involved in breathing. And so when I have people do these breathing drills and I don't see or feel movement in the areas that I should, I know that, okay, we want to be targeting this potentially with breathing drills used as kind of a mobility drill, which is very useful, where you're channeling or kind of directing breath into these more restricted areas. And then we can also target these areas with some of our basic joint mobility drills. It's all very important stuff to do initially. So to go further into an arena that almost nobody is using, that's when we start to evaluate the health of peripheral nerves and the skin, right? Muscles and skin, because we know that the inputs that are coming in, right, have to go somewhere. That's the spinal cord. So starting to evaluate the health of peripheral nerves, because some have shared motor and sensory components. So they will innervate both muscles and skin. Some have only motor, some have only sensory. We got to be able to test these things, and history will kind of lead you to maybe which areas are the most important to test. But that's where I'm kind of going next. Again, some of that is based on history. But if someone tells me that they have had a low back problem for an extended amount of time, and it's come up 3 times in their in the last 5 years, I'm going to start asking questions about that. And maybe they're explaining like sciatic symptoms. Well, I'm going to do tests on their lumbar and sacral region because I want to know like how's that stuff moving. But I'm also going to start testing nerves like the femoral nerve, the tibial nerve, the peroneal nerve. And I'm going to do that with motor testing, like how are those muscles functioning? And then I'm also going to follow up with sensory testing. So I have to know where those nerves originate as far as the spinal segments, and then where do they go? In this case, where does the sensory component go? Like what part of the skin does it supply for sensation? And that's where I run my test. So, for example, it's not uncommon for somebody that has had sacral nerve root issues or disc issues to have some kind of loss of sensation in the gastroc region, the calf muscle. All right, that's not uncommon to find. So I'm going to run sensory tests, and I might find, because I've got tests for 2 different pathways initially that I'm going to look at. So we've got dorsal column tests and spinal thalamic tests, all different sensations. So for the dorsal column, I'm going to test, initially, to be as fast as possible, I'm going to test vibration, 2-point discrimination, and light touch, and get some feedback there. Like, how's that going? Are they feeling that? Is there any side-to-side differences when we compare? And then I'm also going to test something like sharp dull. Does this feel sharp or does this feel dull? And warm cool. And that's going to cover a lot of my, that's going to check a lot of boxes. And maybe I find that there's a specific sensory deficit in one sensation or several sensations. That gives me a lot of information. I don't yet know what the problem is because I have to consider several other levels. But I'm thinking I have to do some level of sensory work in this area and possibly work on the peripheral nerve. And maybe we do that with some of our neuromechanic exercises that we've talked about many times on the podcast. And then I got to consider the spinal segments that are involved with where the nerve originates. And so maybe then I'm seeing that this person that's had several back injuries and is also having this mild sensory loss in their gastroc also has virtually no movement in their sacrum when they walk. And when I have them do some of our joint mobility drills, they can't move their lower back. So now I'm thinking, well, we have to restore movement there because that's going to be part of this whole picture, right? And the process goes on because I have to think about, well, where does that sensory input get processed? So the basic rule that we like to follow is all sensory input goes to the contralateral cortex except smell. So I know that those inputs, that missing sensation that we found, could be causing a higher order issue in the, let's say, contralateral parietal lobe, where that input eventually goes for processing. This is where it gets cool, but this is also where you can lose people because everyone's pretty capable of understanding mechanically how when there's a spinal cord issue, that could affect the nerve that originates there. And if the nerve that originates there has an issue, sure, we are pretty clear on the fact that that could affect the function of muscles and how you feel stuff on the skin.
Mm-hmm. I mean, people take paralysis for granted, right? It's like, oh, someone had a spinal injury and they were paralyzed from this area down. That's like accepted as fact, right?
Yes, and when you have a possible disc issue or you think you might, and you go to a specialist and they check you out, like this is all common knowledge. Like if you work with a neurologist that's checking out your back, they're going to they might do some muscle testing, they might do some sensory testing, they might even check your deep tendon reflexes to get an idea of what's happening with the spinal cord. Okay, so this is pretty widely accepted when we use this sort of mechanical thought process. Okay, it's like, okay, well, the wires start there, they go there. What do they do? What are they for? We got it. The part that's not widely accepted or just more unknown is we also have to consider that there is an eventual consequence to missing sensation. So if you've had a sensory problem ongoing for a long period of time on, let's say, your left gastroc, you also have a right parietal lobe problem. Okay. You also have a medulla issue. So now we're in the brainstem because that's where the pathway decussates, which means crosses at the midline. So by knowing your levels and your pathways, where they start, where they go, you can start to consider other structures that might play a really big role in helping you restore a problem that may have started as a spinal cord injury, but then manifested into peripheral nerve issues, sensation issues, weak muscle issues. And so we have to know how to expand the thinking. That's why I love the 8 levels, because we can do that. And it's a great thought process to use. So now I'm taking it much further. And instead of saying, let's think about this now. You've had a spinal cord injury in the sacrum that has created peripheral nerve issues and loss of sensation and motor control, let's say, in the gastroc on the left side. Now we've got kind of all the boxes checked because we're also doing exercises for the right parietal lobe and integrating that into the training of those muscles that have become atrophied, right? And maybe at the same time, adding in the missing sensation and using that to as activation and teaching the person how to restore their feeling of that sensation, right? It's a great, much more complete way to look at things. The sensory part of rehab is almost 100% ignored, and it's problematic because rehab is totally incomplete without it. Totally. So, and some people are doing it, but a lot of times it's more of like a Hail Mary approach. Like we're gonna put this electrical stim on you with broad strokes. We're gonna use this tool on you with broad strokes rather than being precise and really understanding, okay, what sensation matters here? What receptors are in need of the activation? That's really key. And you can get a good feel for that through thorough neuro evaluations. So everything I described here is an example of kind of starting with movement/motor assessments.
Mm-hmm.
And then based on history and what you're seeing, you let that sort of lead you to where you might think it's important to do some sensory testing.
You laid out how a lack of spinal mobility could indicate other problems, whether it's something along the spinal column or something in a different part of the system, right? That's
Right.
Your parietal lobe or that kind of thing, viscerally referred pain perhaps. But if you have a parietal lobe issue or another issue in the nervous system, does simply mobilizing the spine, like physically moving your spine, potentially do anything for that?
For the cortical issue, like for the parietal
Yeah.
issue?
Yeah.
Yes, it can. Yes, everything in neurology is a two-way street, so it absolutely can. You can find improvements in other areas of the 8 levels from working on a primary area. Yeah, there's no question that that's happening, and that's what's kind of cool too. It's like it's almost like you never have to be perfectly right. You just have to be close. I feel like I'm kind of at a place where it's like at the beginning, right? Learning all this stuff. I was all excited and wanted to find all the problems and wanted to be right. Wanted to be able to say in my mind, that's what that is. And now I'm sort of at a place where I'm like, well, I'm not sure if that's what that is, but we're close enough because our functional outcomes are showing us there's improvement.
Right.
So I really do believe that there's a two-way street in respect to that. And you had mentioned like or said other structures, and there's some there's definitely some stuff to unpack in regard to like posture in the spinal cord, because obviously the spinal cord is a big part of posture, right? We have reflexive systems that hold us upright against gravity, help us recover our balance as we're moving. And it's worth mentioning that, for example, extensor tone, which is basically the muscles on the back of your body, your anti-gravity muscles that are helping you with axial extension, standing up, and essentially think posterior chain muscles as well. A lot of the higher order systems are creating that muscle tone. So one of the ones we talk about a lot, the vestibular system, has a very large role in calibrating extensor tone. And so this goes beyond just having a spinal cord problem, because you could have a vestibular problem that's creating a posture issue that then creates a spinal problem.
Mm.
And then you are seeking to fix a spinal cord problem with, let's say, strengthening exercises. And you're not really getting the changes you think you should be getting because your problem has originated in the inner ear. Right? Like, this is why it's so important to know the role of these higher order systems with what they do with posture and muscle tone. And the same thing holds true for, like, the cerebellum is very much involved in extensor tone in the midline. The brainstem and the cortex really work together to set global muscle tone ipsilaterally. And it's more complicated than I'm describing it, because it's muscle tone of both flexor and extensor compartments. So lots of different muscles involved in this. But the point is, this is all reflexive when we talk about posture and when we talk about balance. And if those higher order things are not doing their job well at the brainstem level, at the cerebellar level, at the cortical level, with the inner ear, whatever it is, the outcome of that can affect the spinal cord. And there's a lot of that happening in the body, which is why in my observations over the years have been that, like, what's happening in orthopedics in regard to the spine is there's a ton of, you need to do this, but nobody actually knows. Like, it becomes way too mechanical. Like, sure, let's get an MRI. We don't see anything. We don't know what's wrong with you. Sorry, you have pain. Go do PT. Or, I think I see a little something here. This must be why you're having pain. Right? And you have to know so much more. You have to know so much more to understand why somebody might be experiencing pain related to the midline, because you have to understand the influence of all these systems. And that's why people get led down these awful rabbit holes, and get recommended surgery when they don't actually need it. Some people do. I'm not saying they don't, but from what I can tell, this area of the industry is where a ton of malpractice is happening. Just back surgeries happening just because it's a last resort and no one can figure out why you're having pain. Yeah, it's not good. It's not good. I mean, there's something people can look up that's kind of popular at this point that will show you. It's a chart that shows you percentages of based on age group, the percentage of ages that have spinal degenerative issues. It's really interesting to see. I think, let me see if I can. Okay, I got it in front of me. For example, this chart says, and it's at the top, it says age-specific prevalence estimates of degenerative spine imaging findings in asymptomatic patients. So these are all people that are asymptomatic, and it says that 80% of 50-year-olds have disc degeneration of some kind. 80%. And it says 52% of 30,
asymptomatic.
They're asymptomatic. Yep. They're asymptomatic. Yeah. And they have some kind of disc degeneration issue, and or that's not causing them problems, right? Not causing them pain. And it's 52% of 30-year-olds, right? And then the list goes on. Like there's more specific stuff here, like disc height loss and disc bulges. Like for disc bulge, it says that 60% of 50-year-olds may have a disc bulge, but they're asymptomatic. 40% of 30-year-olds, right? And there's other stuff you can look at that's similar, but it's fascinating because it leads you right back to what we know about, well, what has modern pain science taught us, that pain does not equal injury and injury does not equal pain. And it gets very complicated when it becomes the spine, and it becomes very urgent feeling, because when you have pain that's happening somewhere in your midline, it feels more important. And I think that's by design, personally. Yeah. That's my belief on that. Because, and it's also because when your, let's say, low back is compromised, all force has to go through that area, right? All force. So sacral issues, low back issues, you feel very compromised because there's a lot of muscle guarding and like inhibition that happens in certain muscles when your body's guarding like that, and then you can't transfer force efficiently anymore. And man, it feels very compromising. Like you can't do the littlest thing. Like I remember when my sacrum was in really rough shape, putting carrots on a cutting board and cutting them, I couldn't do. Like, and it's all because of the stability that has to happen and the intense guarding that happens when you're having a back issue. Like anyone who's had a sacral issue knows, like, oh yeah, when I have to sneeze or cough, like I've known clients that have had severe back issues that when they feel a sneeze coming, they get on the floor. Okay. They know it's coming. They get on the floor and they get into a certain position that feels more stable so that they can create muscular tension to help them buffer the fast, like explosive movement that happens when you sneeze, because it can be so painful.
Yeah.
You know, it's wild. Pain in the middle of the body generally, and again, I think it's kind of by design, it feels more important. And it's weird because even the severity of the pain does not necessarily indicate the severity of the issue.
Right.
So this is why it gets so complicated when you go down the rabbit hole of trying to get professional input on why you have back pain. And it can turn out with, well, they think they see this on my images, and because it's been going on so long and I did 2 bouts of physical therapy, my next step is surgery. And some of the conclusions that are jumped to and possible solutions blow my mind. Like, yeah, let's fuse it. Like people get their spine fused, right? And I'm not saying that some people don't need that. Like that can save a person, but it's happening too much when you don't actually need that. Like there are other solutions. I worked with an ultra marathoner that was in there. He was in his late 20s, and he ended up finding me and had recently had his sacrum fused. I'm like, dude, what? How old are you? He's like 28. Why'd you have your sacrum fused? He's like, well, I'd have back pain for so long and no one could help me. And I did PT for a long time. And they thought if they fused the joint, that then I'd be more stable and now I can run. And it totally screwed him up because he's an ultra runner. Like you can't take away movement at the most important joint for transferring energy across the body and then expect a person to be able to live the same life they were living. And so I was blown away that they would do this to somebody who's 28. And I thought, man, this is crazy. Well, when I run the history, I'm probably going to find out why they did that. I thought, running the history, and it doesn't add up. And I'm like, you're telling me they just fused your spine because of the amount of pain you were in? Because he was in a lot of pain. And he felt like they were out of options. So I started asking more questions. What did I find in his history? Well, he's had chronic gut problems for over 20 years tons of digestive sensitivities and celiac disease. So I'm like, oh man, not another one of these cases. Because the most malpractice in my eyes in this sort of arena with orthopedics and the spine is metabolic and gut problems manifesting into what may or may not be a spinal issue, but it certainly is spinal pain, right? And then people getting these crazy surgeries when really they had a health problem. And our listeners should know that most back problems are health problems. They're not back problems. You got to know that, right? As if you're a professional in the industry, you got to know that. Once again, I'm not saying that back issues don't exist. I'm not saying that, disc issues can't, be a thing. And I'm not saying that nobody needs surgery. There's a time and place for that stuff. But what I am witnessing is that the crazy surgeries like fusing the spine are being thrown around when, in this case, the guy just needed better gut health. He went on to get that surgery reversed, as a matter of fact. I didn't work with him for long, but I do remember him, getting that reversed somehow. And I don't know the outcome of that, but it was interesting for me to get that history because I was like, oh man, I've seen this so many times. If somebody would just take your history, right? If somebody would just take your history and know that chronic irritation of the gut could create sacral pain, they would at least be able to say, explore that avenue before we decide to make your spine immobile, So it's so misunderstood. The whole thing's so misunderstood. And it's important to know this stuff and consider that there are a lot of other things that could be going on if you're seeking help for a possible spinal issue.
We've been calling it a two-way street, but it feels more like a five-way intersection.
Yes.
Between like the gut and the organs and the midline, and then what can happen with the peripheral nerves and the other nerves that go out into the extremities, and then what can happen in the brain. The fact that the vestibular system could create a posture issue that could then manifest as a spinal issue.
Right. There's a lot there.
I was very tempted with this episode to say, if we're going to talk about spinal mobility, like maybe we'll talk about drills to physically mobilize the spine. And I do wonder if that's still kind of like we were talking about with the windmills, just kind of like nice drilling to do to optimize spinal health. But the conversation has really more been about just how complicated and connected the spine is to so many other things. And I think that's a really interesting and important takeaway.
For sure.
Do you think it's worth talking about any drills to mobilize the spine, or is that sort of missing the point here?
No, I think it's legit. I mean, I can just kind of rapid fire a couple things, and it's, to be honest with you, it's nothing I haven't said before. Yeah. Right. And that's the thing. Like the if tools,
only they listen to you the first time,
Yeah. The toolbox is always really the same. It's just, you might make tweaks in how you apply it or select different things. But, for example, on our YouTube channel, we've got a lot of mobility and motor control drills, and lots of them are targeted at the midline, right? So that means learning how to move your neck, learning how to move your thoracic spine, your lumbar spine, even your pelvis and jaw, those important midline structures. We have mobility drills for all of those areas. So I encourage people to check out the YouTube channel and find those spinal drills, because that's the kind of stuff I'm practicing very consistently. I have been for years. I check in on that stuff all the time, just for general health. And you want to get good at it. And what's going to happen is if you haven't done anything like that before, your coordination is going to be really lousy when you're trying to coordinate the drills. That's okay. That's where it starts. And your goal is to get better at coordinating it and then kind of work harder at end range of motion. So now you can start developing some improved actual mobility and range of motion. So it's kind of a combined, like, building your motor control, but also improving some range of motion as well. All right. So those drills are available. And then obviously the neuromechanic category of drills that our listeners probably see me sharing a lot on Instagram. That's our, like, nerve glides is a short way to describe them. There's lots of different things there. Like, our students will chuckle and say, yeah, nerve glides, but you left out all the nerve slacking drills. You left out all the nerve sliding drills. We teach a ton in the courses, but basically those neuromechanic drills that put gentle tension on a peripheral nerve, and then you learn how to mobilize it. I've got several tutorials at this point on YouTube that people can check out that are more long form, that teach the details of them. Those are wonderful for kind of creating more opportunity to move better in the spine. So, for example, starting with some of those neuromechanic drills and then going to the joint mobility drills, you might feel like you can do them better. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's a nice combination. Never forget breathing. Breathing drills will improve spinal mobility. So if you're a poor breather, like a shallow breather, you'll likely have rib cage restriction. You likely won't move in certain ways well with your spine. Drills like diaphragm stretch that we've talked a lot about on previous episodes. Lots of different breathing drills you can find on our YouTube channel. They're great for creating more targeted mobility drills for the trunk and spine. So, like, we have different opener drills where you're in a specific posture, creating gentle stretch through a certain area of the trunk, let's say. And then at the same time, you're focusing on breathing and you're trying to direct the breath into that area to create that feeling of expansion and stretch. That style of breathing drill can be quite useful for improving mobility. So those are sort of like the basics that I would say everybody should check out. And then to go further and get nerdier, you have to start venturing into the eyes and the inner ear. So, for example, vestibular drills can have a very large impact on how your spine is moving. So you might find that practicing some of our basic vestibular drills on the YouTube channel, like VORs, and I actually have a video on YouTube that teaches a vestibular drill called the infinity walk and kind of educationally relates it back to how this corresponds to the midline and the posterior chain of muscles. So people can look for that one. It's a great exercise, the infinity walk. So vestibular inputs can make a big impact on the spine. So consider that. So your eyes too. And to tie it all together, integrated exercises that look similar to walking, running, or throwing. Okay, this is like the pinnacle for me. If I'm working with somebody that has a really lousy midline, they're not moving well. Typically, what that means is if you have poor spinal mobility, you're not walking well either. And there's a lot of compensatory things happening that over time can lead to other issues, through, breakdown of movement. So I like to get these people moving with this kind of contralateral patterning that looks like walking, because that's how we were intended to move, with this contralateral or reciprocation of our limbs. And I love creating exercise that does that. You can do that quite well with pulley machines. You can do that quite well with bands. And we talked at the beginning of the episode about like steel clubs and Indian clubs. I do a lot of this kind of thing with those.
I stole one of your drills from an Instagram reel, where it's almost like you're pitching a ball,
yep,
but with the club. And so, it's like your whole body twists,
You got
like
it.
your back foot comes up onto the ball of the foot. And yeah,
You're
I really like
connecting.
that one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're connecting the lower body to the upper body in respect to the reflexes we have for movement. Okay, so and this is not like there's some good stuff out there people can find. The industry mistake right now is to make it all about fascia. That's what's happening. Is like, so like you just described, like pitching or doing a club exercise that resembles that same similar patterning. Right now the industry is in a place where it's all about fascial slings, right? And so people want that to only be about fascia. Oh my gosh, if you are thinking that this is only about fascia, please keep going. There is so much more to this neurologically than the supposed fascial lines that have been shown to us in the textbook. Like, that's a cool idea. There's something there, but like, keep going, because you can't think only fascial lines without understanding actual pathways and reflexes that control the reciprocation. Like, there is a brain area called the mesencephalic locomotor area that we know how to activate with a variety of exercises that is for walking. So there's so much more there, and it is thrilling to learn about it at the brain level, because then you can connect it to what you already know biomechanically. And then you have kind of the ultimate combination where you're looking at biomechanics and studying biomechanics, and then you're also considering the neurology and the reflexive stuff and where that actually comes from, the control centers. And that's where it gets really fun. So anyways, the whole point there was to tie it all together after we've done maybe some work in isolation, like the joint mobility, the breathing, the vision, the vestibular exercises. We want to start getting people moving in an integrated way with opposite hand, opposite leg type patterning. That is phenomenal for tying it all together, for improving the health of the midline altogether and the spine.
Well, an hour and a half in, and I feel like there's still more to talk about.
Seriously. Oh, there always is. Our episodes are slowly getting a little longer, which is more work for you, but I appreciate it.
True. No, of course. I think the conversations deserve the time. And so, insofar as you're willing to talk to everybody about it, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's encourage people here to, there's a few things I can direct people to. Number one, if you've been listening to the podcast and you haven't already done so, as far as giving us a review, we'd really appreciate that. It really helps. It's I can't stress it enough. And if you have given us a review, thank you so much. And I like hearing from those of you who have reached out in the DMs and stuff to tell me you've been listening to the podcast. It's really cool to meet you guys and know that you're enjoying it. And if you have not seen the free masterclass, it's still available. So you can find the free masterclass through our website or through the show notes here. If you're kind of just getting on board now and listening to these conversations and you want to start going a little deeper into neuro, watch the free masterclass, because that one was specifically on cranial nerves. And it's a really neat way to get started with some of the work we do, because I teach you the general assessment process that I basically teach everybody. And then we do talk about other structures and kind of how the neurology of movement happens, but we get to cranial nerves too. And I give you some really fun drills that are really simple to learn, and you can test them on yourself and see how they're affecting your movement. And most people are going to find at least one that makes a drastic impact in how they're moving and how they're feeling. So again, if you're just starting to get into, neuro, make sure you watch that, because it's a good resource. Thank you all for listening. Really appreciate it, and we'll be back soon.